So today we're talking about React Actions with Sam Selikoff. You might know Sam from his conference talks in React in Next.js Conf or Tailwind Merge, or you might know him from his YouTube channel with the amazing content he creates, or the Frontend First podcast with Ryan, or from his amazing platform BuildUI, where he publishes courses around React animations and Tailwind and stuff. So, Sam, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much, man. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you, man. I met you in person. Actually, watched two of your talks in person, the Tailwind Merge in Canada, and where you talked about lots of cool Tailwind tricks. I love just watching you work with Tailwind, man. I want to just watch over your shoulder how you use your keyboard. And also, I saw you on Next.js Conf with the talk you had there, and I look up to you, man. When you have such a cool, calm, and confidence cadence to your talks, it's amazing.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate that. It's funny, a lot of folks on YouTube talk about the editor stuff too. So I know that there is like a Vim VS Code's course, tricks, patterns thing in my future. It's going to happen for sure. But yeah, I appreciate the kind words, man.
Absolutely, man. Okay, so before we dive into React Actions and unpack what they are in React 19 and how it ties back to maybe a framework like Next.js, several components, but also outside of that, why don't we have a little introduction about your journey into this and now ending up working on front-end first frameworks like React and Next.js?
Yeah, so I started out in PHP actually around 2012, maybe 2013, kind of learned how to code back then. And I got into PHP and the web pretty soon and pretty quickly found out that I really liked the UI UX part. You know, I had lots of opinions and desire to make the UI just do exactly what I wanted. And so I found myself doing JavaScript and kind of rich UI stuff even back then. Ember was like the first real framework I used. Well, I guess Backbone, I used that, but Backbone didn't have many rendering primitives at all. Actually, the render function was like a no-op, so it still left it up to you. Ember was the first framework I used that had this notion of declarative rendering, and then eventually came into React. But I have a lot of full-stack framework. My job before I started working for myself was at TED Talks, the conference company. That's what brought me to New York City, and that's how I met my business partner, Ryan. And we did a lot of full-stack work there. And so I've always done, you know, everything from the database to CSS, but I just find myself liking the front end the most and spending the most time there. So that's kind of what I'm doing these days.
Awesome. I came across your content probably around React and more likely frame of motion stuff, animations. And then I remember you were launching the BuildUI platform where you had this frame of motion course, and I got the membership there. It's an amazing platform for anyone who is using React. You have Remix courses, Next.js stuff. I have seen Ryan also produces their animations and Tailwind stuff and more to come. So it's definitely a platform for front-end folks or React folks to check out. I am also following you there. I bought your courses. So in terms of the React Actions and diving into this new concept and new updates that are coming into React and Next.js 15. Let's peel it back to just speak about React and React Actions, and then maybe at the end we tie it into Next.js stuff. So I'll just leave it to you. I'll ask questions. I'll interrupt you if I had questions in the middle, and then we will keep it conversational. But we want to understand what React Actions are and how it's going to help change some of the stuff that we're doing already in React.
Cool. Sounds great. Yeah, so, you know, on BuildUI, we teach some different specific concepts. We've been wanting to make kind of a full stack course for a while. We did do that with Remix because Remix kind of last year was in a really good spot. Actually, a lot of the primitives that came to Remix inspired what we're seeing now in React, like actions. And we were kind of wanting to make that next version of that full stack course that uses React 19 or Next. And they're kind of in a holding period right now. They haven't been released. But these ideas we're going to talk about, if anyone's familiar with Remix or even some of the fundamental web stuff, the way server-side frameworks like Rails and Laravel work, it's going to sound pretty familiar. So I think the most exciting thing about all this stuff is that we're finally getting a first-class way to do data fetching, data mutation across all React apps. And today, let's just focus on the mutation side, so the writing side. And that's what actions are. Now, React actions it's kind of confusing just because the first time the word action was really heard or introduced with React or the React ecosystem was really server actions in Next.js. And, the folks who work on Next are also folks who work on React. They work closely with other people on the React core team. So that's how they developed. Because Next was like the first framework to really kick the tires on some of these new abstractions that are now in first-class React. But I gave a conference talk at ReactConf this year about actions, just client-side actions, because it turns out that actions in React aren't just about server actions and they're not just about Next.js. So what is an action? Well, most React developers, the way we submit data, let's say you're filling out an input for a title and then a content for a blog post, you're going to render the input tags, put it in a form, and then what are you going to do? You're going to say form on submit equals handle submit. You're going to have E as an event handler. You're going to call prevent default. And then you're going to await maybe a fetch to an endpoint that's like a post endpoint to a blog. And you're going to put the data in there as JSON. And you're going to await that. And then it's going to come back. And then you're going to update your UI. You're going to call set state with the response. And that's kind of how we've done it. And I can even pull up my code here from my talk just to give folks a little bit of context. I think it might be easier if we just do that.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
Awesome. So how do I share my screen? I'll just do the entire screen. I think that'll be easiest, right?
Yeah.
Cool. So here is kind of the first version of the first page of my talk here. And then just to see the UI, it looks something like this. It was very simple, little cart form where you can add items to your stock and you can submit them and see how it updates. And then if there's an error and you try to add it to cart, it shows that it's out of stock. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to go through all the code. Folks, we'll definitely link the blog post so people can watch that coding if they want to. But this should look pretty familiar to most React developers. You have the on submit right here. You have a button. And then, you do all this stuff. And so this is really the motivation for actions coming to React, is to give us a way to do this stuff where it doesn't feel like we're doing it from scratch every time. So that was a lot. Maybe we can pause there and see if you have any questions.
Okay, so let's. I'm going to unpack this previous or the traditional way of handling form submissions, just to be on the same page and understand where we're coming from. So we have this handle form submission where we are managing our loading state or error state separately. We are calling an API endpoint. We update a local state, our loading state, error state if anything happens, and then we get the data back. So we set the data, and that's done. So this is the way that we used to do it. 3 different states. In the beginning, you are using useQuery or any data fetching library, client-side data fetching library for that matter, to get the initial data and then go through the form submission.
Exactly. And this is, like you said, all happening on the client. So this is just good old bread and butter client-side React. None of this stuff starts working until, you render the page, and then it's all happening in the browser, which is nice because it doesn't do like the full page refresh, kind of why we started using JavaScript in the beginning. Yeah. But this is all happening in the client. So, the client is kind of this long-lived stateful UI environment. It can make things difficult. And that's why we have, async, and we have different states that manage things and race conditions and all that sort of thing that comes into play. But yes, this is all happening client. This has nothing to do with Next. It has nothing to do with server components or server actions. So this is just plain client-side React.
Good.
So there are some problems with this. Specifically, if you try to click add to cart a couple times, and this is kind of the final version, but you can imagine, again, you've probably seen this code a ton. You have race conditions that go on here. And if we look at the code, what happens if I press that button twice? Well, we're going to run this function twice. And this is an asynchronous function, so it takes time. And so the first time we go through, we set is pending to true, and then we await fetch. And now what if this takes a long time and the user presses it a second time? So second time, we're going to call this again, and we're going to set is pending to true, and then we're going to send out the second fetch. But in the meantime, the first one might have gotten back, and it might have set pending to false. So very quickly, you can see how this kind of code really creates a lot of race conditions without you even having to do much at all. You could be, maybe you're not thinking about it, you're not aware of it. There's nothing in the code and the patterns that nudge you to account for these race conditions. There's no TypeScript telling us that we've written something wrong and we haven't handled a specific case, even though there are many paths through this code because of the asynchrony. And so that's kind of the first thing here, is that all of this manual state management that we have to do and the fact that we have multiple submissions going on concurrently can create a lot of race conditions. And again, if anyone's been writing React, I'm sure they've run into these sorts of things.
Absolutely.
So the first kind of update here is this new API that's come to React called startTransition. And what startTransition does, and it's nice to understand how this works because we're kind of building to actions, which is this new primitive. StartTransition, you can think of it like a bombshell for all of this asynchronous code. It's really like the React core team had this really nice phrase that they used during their keynote where they said, a lot of what we're trying to do, a lot of what we do as UI developers, UI programmers, is solve this coordination problem. Anytime you request data in a client app that lives in a database somewhere, you're kind of seeing a cached version of it. It's like a materialized view. And it could have changed. And you could do something that changes it. And so the question is, how do you orchestrate what's happening on this kind of remote, faraway client with the source of truth that's in a database somewhere? A lot of the hardest problems with what we do as React developers comes down to this orchestration problem. So what startTransition does is it says, well, if you pass an async function, anything you do in here, we're basically going to just do it in a little bomb shelter. You have your current app, which has to be responsive because people need to be able to click things while other things are happening. We can never just freeze our UI. That would be nice, right? You take an action, you just freeze everything, but you can't do that because it's UI. You want things to stay responsive. Mm-hmm. So instead what we're going to do is we're basically going to fork your app. Just think of it like forking your app. And we're going to attempt all of this stuff right here. Everything that you gave us in a transition, we're going to try to do it in a new version of your app, a forked version that's kind of in the background, and see what happens. And once everything settles down, we now have the new version of your app, and we're going to merge it back. It's almost like Git. You branch, you make changes, and then you merge back into main. Mm-hmm. So that's what's happening with startTransition.
Okay. So let me clarify my understanding from what startTransition is doing, and then you correct me if I miss anything there. So with the startTransition, we're trying to prevent this race condition of a user clicking the buttons 2-3 times at a time and interrupt that state update on the side so that we are not ending up with this concurrent requests going on. So we're almost doing it on the side as if we are marking it as a low priority. Just here, do it. If nothing else is going on, if no interaction is happening, do it, finish it, come back. But if something else happens, interrupt that, something else is happening, and then update that according to that. Now, transitions has been in React before, so React 19 just added the async ability to it, so it allows us to then now await a fetch call there and use it in this context of marking this state update as a transition, so it doesn't block the UI and it doesn't end up with concurrent requests.
Exactly right. So, like you said, you use the phrase low priority. Sometimes you'll hear it called low priority or non-urgent. And the idea here is that, like you said, all of these things are kind of in this forked version of our app, and they're not going to be merged back in with our main app. They're not going to apply to the current UI until it's in a good settled state. There's no more asynchronous stuff happening. So that immediately takes care of this pending problem where the first action sets pending back to false, but the second action is still awaiting that fetch. That's okay because these things are all happening in that other universe that's still running, and we're not going to even apply these state updates until everything settles. So the way I like to think about it is, if you make a to-do app with React state and you have no asynchrony at all, you just call set state when you delete something, when you add something, it's the easiest thing in the world. I mean, everything is instant. There's no race conditions because everything is synchronous, right?
Yep.
So the goal is to kind of make our asynchronous code feel like that synchronous code. Mm-hmm. And also, like you said, we have had transitions in React for a while, but they did not accept async functions. So the question is, well, if we had transitions 2 years ago in React, but they didn't take in an async function, what's the point? Because synchronous React has no race conditions. So why would you start a transition and start setting state when it's only synchronous code? Well, the thing is that sometimes setting state can trigger a re-render that causes the new tree to suspend. Mm-hmm. And that's asynchronous. Mm-hmm. So let's say you had something like, set blog post ID to 2 when you click on the second blog post. Mm-hmm. And this thing is being used down here in your tree where, you have like a blog post for ID of the blog post ID, right? And inside of here, you're doing something that suspends. Whether you're doing it on the client with something like use query or, now with server components. The point being, sometimes setting state actually does cause the new version of your UI to be rendered, but it's not ready yet because there's some asynchrony.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned it because I was thinking about the same thing. I thought about it in the context of how the client-side navigation works and how it's like a transition behind the scene. But the example that you gave, it also clarifies that you may just set state, and what that set state is going to trigger down in the tree might be some asynchronous tasks. So that's why startTransition or transition was even useful back then without the async.
Exactly. And you mentioned that router navigations are usually transitions. That's kind of a separate thing we can maybe touch on at the end. But for now, I think it's easiest to think about it without any URL. It's just that sometimes setting state can trigger a suspending tree. And so as soon as you have a suspending tree, we're back in the land of async and race conditions and what happens in that in-between state. So that's what this is all about.
Awesome.
The other thing I'll just mention really quick is that if this suspends, this component right here suspends because it needs to make a network request to fetch the data or hit a database, that's what we call network bound. So it's bound by the network. It's not ready because it needs to go to the network. There's another kind of slow rendering that's CPU bound, where setting this state, let's say we were to set time period to like last year, right? And then instead of a blog post, I have a chart with a time period. And this chart now gets updated, and it's not network bound. It doesn't need to go fetch data, but it needs to render a chart. And rendering the chart can take a lot of CPU cycles.
Yep.
It's intense because of the CPU side. The actual rendering is slow. And if I had an input that I want the user to be able to type in, we don't want necessarily to lock up the whole UI while that chart is rendering. So that's an example of rendering being CPU bound. And we also have network bound, but both cases, you can understand why you want to be able to mark certain parts of the tree as low priority or not urgent. This helps me understand transitions because they're talked about as like low priority and non-urgent. And this is a good explanation why. If something's taking a long time, but I want to go to the next tab and I don't want to have to wait for that whole page, that makes sense. It's non-urgent, which basically means it's interruptible. So I can kind of just back out of it. We're trying to paint the chart over in this other universe. It's taking a long time. It uses a Fibonacci sequence or whatever. And I just want to go to another tab. We're just going to throw that away and not worry about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because in the context of keeping the UI interactive, what you're saying is that it doesn't matter if the state update is going out on the network to fetch some data from the database or the state update is just too much work and it's taking time. With transitions, you can still interrupt it and leave the UI interactive instead of blocking it until this time-consuming thing is getting done.
Perfectly said.
Okay.
Okay. So that's where transitions were for the last 2 years. And they weren't async. They just basically had an effect if setting state, which again, this part is still synchronous. It happens immediately, but it could cause one of those two paths where you have a slow tree and you need to wait for it and you want to be able to abort it. So that's what transitions were all about. But now we can pass in an async function. It's almost like a way to think about, instead of having to go through this where we set this and then render something that suspends, let's just give it an async function. And that's almost like, it's almost like suspending, right? It's almost like we're just telling it we have some work that's going to take some time. So just go ahead and mark that as low priority and put all those things over here, right? Mm-hmm. And this is an action. This is all an action is. An action is when you pass an async function into startTransition. That is what an action is. Mm-hmm. And it's a new capability that React 19 has introduced. And the reason it's called an action is because it is the intention, the semantic meaning of it is we're making a mutation. We're changing something on the server. We're changing data, right? Because if we were fetching data that took a long time, well, we should be rendering. Mm-hmm. Or if we're rendering something that's CPU intensive, we should be rendering something. But this is not rendering. This is a function that's executing it as a result of some event or an effect, right? And the fact that it's an action, that's why it gets that name. It's an action.
Got it. Okay, so we have the action, which is basically a function that mutates some data back in our database, mm-hmm. or in the sense of updating some states in our app, and we passing it to startTransition that allows us to just mark that mutation as non-interruptive or low priority, so we can leave the UI as still being interactive.
Exactly.
And then we have the action prop, which is a similar naming convention for forms.
So let me
that ties back into
Yes, absolutely. So this is all an action is, and again, we're still in client-side React. No Next, no server components, no server actions. This is just something you can do in React 19 today. And what's the benefit? Well, the first benefit is you already avoid these race conditions. The set is pending true and false because they're batched up and not applied until the world is in a settled state. You don't get those race conditions. So right away, that's a benefit. Mm-hmm. Now, what you'll notice in the UI is if you were to do this, you wouldn't see this spinner anymore. And again, you can see this in my talk. But that's because set is pending is changing this state right here. And we're rendering the spinner down here when is pending is true. So if we are trying to set is pending to show that something's happening, but it only happens in another world, in a forked version of our app, that doesn't get applied until it comes back, at which point pending has been set back to false, so we're not going to see anything. How do we know if there's an action running? Well, this is where useTransition comes in. So this is like the second step. We have useTransition right here. And you'll see that this gives us a startTransition as well as an isPending flag that will update in the current UI. And now in our onSubmit, when we wrap our action, when we create our action using startTransition from this hook, as opposed to what we did in the first one, which is just importing it from React itself, now we have like a stateful variable that shows us whether or not the action is running. And so when we do that and we use isPending, then we get the spinner back in our UI. But it never flips back and forth. And if you look at this action, we don't even have this set is loading to true, set is loading to false anymore. It's all managed by React for us.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm taking it a step back from action prop and the forms. We're still in the transitions.
Yes.
And we want to see the benefit of using it. So with the transition, we mark this update as interruptive. So you can interrupt it. It doesn't block the UI.
Yes.
But then we also, the first benefit was that it avoided race conditions, because if the user clicks that button again, it's not going to have concurrent requests going on.
Exactly.
Now, the second benefit is that it gives you a pending state. So it says, okay, I have some action running here. I have some transitions happening here. And as long as this transition is in work, I'm going to give you this pending state that you can use, so you don't have to set local loading state. So you use the useTransition hook to get the startTransition function back, but also this is pending. So all of this is still not doing anything with the form actions. It's just actions and transitions implemented in a custom manner, benefiting from the concurrency that gives us and also the pending state.
Exactly. The concurrency is a benefit, so we don't stomp on each other, because we don't have to even reason anymore about all of the ways users can go through our app if they start pressing the button a lot of times. I mean, every single await you have is basically a new state that your app can be in, right? Every time you add an await, there's a state of your app that exists before the await and after the await. And those are different. And the data in your app is different. So every time you have an await, you have a state before and after. And every time you submit a form and you run that again, it's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 that you have to think about how all these things are going to interact. So putting it into a box lets React handle all that. And giving us isPending lets us know when any action that's been kicked off using this startTransition is still pending, is still running. And so it doesn't matter how many times we click it or what state our app was in. It is going to tell us there are still some actions that have not settled yet. And again, think about it like we get to think of this like now we have collapsed all of those 2 by 2 by 2 by 2 states into a single isPending true or false. And React can handle all of that and make sure it doesn't contaminate any part of our UI, which lets us think, either it's before the action or actions have run or after. That's it.
Awesome.
So that is how the pending flag works. I thought there was something else I was going to say. Can't think right now. And so if we look at this, this is kind of like the low level. This was the other thing I was going to say. Not only do we have the 2 by 2 by 2, but if we were to call it composes. So if we had an async, another like action in here or something else that called another transition, it kind of composes all the way down. So this is the point I wanted to make. It's not only about the concurrency, and it's not only about avoiding the race conditions. It's the fact that React has knowledge of this async work that's happening. Think about before when we use query. Does React know that our query is running? Or think about our first version that's naive here, where we set is pending to true, and this is just our own state. This doesn't mean anything to React at all. It doesn't even know. It's just a Boolean state. It doesn't know. It doesn't have any meaning or semantics for it. And there's no way that we can compose this is pending with something like an is loading from use query, or an is pending from use mutation, or an is animating from framer motion. So anything that takes time in React that has its own state, it's off to us to say like, let is actually ready is going to be, if we're not is pending and we're not is animating, right? And we've all written stuff like this before, but transitions compose. And so if you have more start transitions in here, even inside of it, even if you call something from a library or another await or anything like that in the actual, in this version, it's going to stay pending that whole time. And so this opens up some really cool new composition patterns we can talk about later, but that's just the last point I wanted to make.
Awesome.
Okay, so like you said, this is kind of like we're wiring it up ourselves. You can see how there's a lot of power here, but this is going to be so common that to simplify this, React added the action prop to forms, and that's what this looks like. So now we're getting to where you've seen before, probably again with server actions, but this is actually, again, nothing to do with Next. This is something that React does. This is from React. And what this does is lets you pass an async function. You can see right here. This is just an async function. startTransition is nowhere to be found. And what this does is internally it marks any async function, any function you pass here as a transition, which is why it's called action. Because again, an action is just an async transition. So now we have exactly all the benefits that we had before. We have all the concurrency and race conditions taken care of. We won't see any stale updates ever just by using form and action.
Okay, awesome. Now this makes sense because the transition was the foundation of how this new action prop or client action in React works. So we went 2 steps back to understand what's happening, or what do we mean by async, what do we mean by transitions. Now with this action prop on the forms, it just takes care of all of that out of the box. So it wraps it or marks it as a transition, so you don't have to just customly write that transition, and it gives you the pending state as well as that async function that you can pass it to your form action.
Yes, we don't have the pending state right here actually. So by default, if you're in something like a server component, you won't have it, but we're about to get to that. But by default, it just marks it as a transition. So it's more like kind of our first example right here, where we didn't have the pending state yet because we were just using startTransition straight from React. But again, the benefit from here was the concurrency. And also you'll notice in our version where we were manually wiring this up, we were wiring this to onSubmit, and onSubmit has an event handler that we need to pass and call prevent default. And that's because by default, submitting a form in HTML makes a post request that refreshes the page. So we've all seen this a million times. We have to do this every time. If you look at the form action example, there's no event. There's no event.prevent default. And that's because React is basically taking care of that for us. So in addition to marking it as a transition, it is saying, oh, we're on the client. We want to do a client-side form submission. Let's prevent default. So you don't have to. And you might have also seen this, that this also gets the form data. So if you had something like, this UI right here doesn't have any actual like form data. It's just a simple form submission with like add, so there's no difference. But if you had, an input with name, title for the blog post, this would show up in the form data. That's kind of an argument to this as well. So that's like another great benefit. But even beyond that, this takes care of event.prevent default. What's cool, it's a little bit of an aside, but where does this action name come from, you might wonder? Well, this is actually part of HTML. If you've ever written PHP before, or Rails or anything like that, the action is like the path, usually in HTML, If I were to just render an HTML form that said action equals do something .php or whatever, and I click that, I submit that form with a button or anything, that's going to actually make a request, a request to this URL.
Endpoint.
And you can, exactly. And you can do get or you can do post. So that's where all of this comes from. And again, an action is really semantically kind of about, I guess by default forms in HTML use a get, which usually you would use for something like, oh, I want to do this, and like search equals, Ahmed, right? So that's more about getting data, but most of the times we use forms for posting data, for doing mutations. And so that's kind of the idea behind the action word. It's an action as opposed to a query. It's like a mutation, right?
Exactly.
But that's where the name comes from. And what's cool about this is that React does some really neat things that if you server-side render your React app, before JavaScript's even loaded, you could submit a form. I could load this screen right here and press this button. And if I didn't have JavaScript loaded, if I was on the subway, I live in New York City, I go on the subway a lot of times things are slower to load. If I press this, it would be like an old school page where I click it, the whole page refreshes, but it would all work. Everything would work. And so that's also the idea behind using this, is that it's progressive and it supports progressive enhancement, even for forms, which is really cool. So anyways, that's what an action prop does. It marks the async function you pass in as an action, so you don't have to yourself. And then now the question is, well, we don't have that pending state anymore, so how do we get that? Well, you could use transition again. So use transition if you wanted to, just like we saw, and you get is pending start transition. And again, because transition's composed, you could wrap this in your own start transition. So this is just nice because, again, you're getting the concurrency benefits. Now you're getting the pending state back, but you're also getting the benefits of form action prop. You don't have event.prevent default. You get progressive enhancement. You get the form data passed in as an argument, so you don't have to put it all in state and wire up change handlers to every input. Lots of benefits there. So you could do that. Or you could use action state. So use action state is, I think, how most folks are going to be doing this. If you look at this, this is pretty clean. We've got a form, an action that points to an async function. Use action state takes in our action, which is just our async function. Again, no calls to start transition here. It's all the business logic. And it gives us three things. We're familiar with this pending. That's, again, if any of these are happening and they're not ready, they're not settled, that will stay as pending. It gives us our async function as an action. So you can, this is the action that's wrapped and tied to is pending. It's kind of like it's just using use transition for us. And this is what we pass into our form. And so that's all just like we've seen before. But the third thing it gives us is state. So what is state? Well, here we have everything wired up. Everything's looking good. We have our is pending indicator, but there's still some state that we're managing here, right? Set error null or set error JSON.error. And that's this use state right here. And if we try to add to cart and we get an error, which you'll see if we're out of stock, so I can increase my stock to 1, add it, and then we'll see it goes up to 49. But if I have none left and I try to add it, then it will error. So how do we show that error? Well, typically, we're managing yet another piece of state, right? But again, there's some concurrency concerns here, right? What if I add to cart 3 times and the first 2 work? So this is going to just revalidate, and then the third one sets this error. Or what if the first one errors for this reason or some other reason, but then there's a stock update and now it's okay? You see, we're back to managing concurrency. We're back to thinking about time and having to orchestrate these things. So anytime you're calling set state in an async function, I've come to believe this. I had an interesting conversation with Ryan recently where every time we use an async function in an effect, it's almost like a code smell. I'm starting to believe that. If you ever use async in an effect, you're probably better off pulling the part that's changing out somehow, either in like a store or into something that uses a transition and having it just be synchronous code. So anyways, this set error is still doing state management around and await. Scary stuff. Scary stuff. You should be scared if you're doing that. Concurrency bugs. Dragons, beware. And so instead of calling set error here based on the return value, right? Because that's where this is coming from. The server is telling us whether it's an error or not. The source of truth for the error is from the server. And that's usually the kind of thing we want to show in the UI somehow, whether an email's been taken when you're trying to sign up for a new account, whether there was no stock left. So that's what this third argument is about from useActionState. We've got the isPending, we've got our wrapped action, and then we have state. And this represents the last return value of a submission. And if we look at this, the refactor here, we just get to return this. And if we return this, we don't have any error in our useState anymore that we have to set and reset and make sure to keep in sync. Again, orchestration. It's like keeping that error state in sync with the current, like the last version of the action that we tried to submit. It just comes here, right back here from useActionState. And so if we return something, this thing is going to be an error. If it's okay, we're going to revalidate. We don't return anything, so it's going to be null. And then down here in our template, we can just say, oh, if we have an error, show it.
Awesome. Okay, so let's go through this one more time. With the useActionState, we are passing an action to this hook. That action, that asynchronous function, was the same action we had before, that we marked it as a transition and passed it to our onSubmit handler. But this time, we're just passing it to this useActionState, which is going to in turn give us back some useful functions and states. The first function, the most important one, was the add to cart action. That's the action you pass to your form action prop. But because React is doing this thing behind the scene and wrapping it or marking it as a transition, it also gives you the isPending. So we have our loading state back. And on top of that, we are getting the return value of our action as the state, which we called it the error because in case of any error, we return that, and now we have this error state. So it gives us all of the stuff that we were managing manually before with different states, all jam-packed in this one useActionState that marks this async mutation as a transition, gives us the loading state, the error state, and an action that we can pass into our forms.
Perfect. That was perfect. And it's not even that the thing on the right is just the thing on the left rewritten, right? Which is much easier because we don't have these states. It's all handled by React for us. We don't have prevent default and set and clear and clear. It's not just a rewriting. It's better because it removes a lot of the bugs that this code has. This code has a lot of bugs, concurrency bugs, race conditions, showing invalidating, showing stale updates to the UI. All of those things are gone here as in addition to it being cleaner and us just having to manage less state.
Absolutely.
So great summary, by the way. That was perfect. So this is kind of like, I think, what a lot of these are going to look like, when people just use it day to day, or, form library abstractions and libraries that come out on top of it are going to be using this under the hood. And this is nice to show a pending spinner and to kick off an action or many actions that are all going to make sure we have consistent updates to our screen. But sometimes you want things to change right away. And again, if we wanted to show optimistic updates, we can't come here in our action and start saying, like, let's say we liked a tweet on Twitter, right? You click like, it just animates right away. So how do we do that? Well, we wouldn't use isPending. I mean, isPending is going to be true right away, but you don't want to show that it's a like based on if isPending is true, because that's going to flip back to false once it saves. We can't do something like set optimistic liked right here, right? Because this is in the transition, so it doesn't apply until it all settles. So how do we build a like button on Twitter using actions? Well, this is where useOptimistic comes in. This is really cool. So how do you know, first of all, when you initially render the page, whether a tweet is liked or not? Well, you use your query, you get the data, and then once you iterate over the data, you show whether each one is liked or not. So the source of truth for whether a tweet is liked is the server. It's the server side, because that like exists in a database somewhere. That's easy when it's read-only. We just fetch the data and render each tweet and show whether it's liked or not. What about when you click on that like button? There's an interesting thing that happens here. If you want to show optimistic UI, where it becomes liked right away, the source of truth is no longer what's in the database. While the action has gone out and we're sending that like back to our database in that pending period, our UI, we want to show that you've clicked on that. So the source of truth kind of has moved from the server to the client. And this is exactly what you want to think about as a trigger, as a spidey sense for saying, I need use optimistic. That's exactly what use optimistic is for. So this is a new hook in React. You give it the canonical server-side data, and it is just like useState. It gives you a reader and a writer, a getter and a setter. And down in your UI, when you run your action, we can now call set optimistic data. And in our case, we're just incrementing the items by 1. So if you look at the demo, it looks like this one doesn't have it. But let me see if I can just go here to page and paste this in. So here, now I'm clicking 53, 54. And you see that it goes up by 1 right away, even though we still have a pending count going. There you see it came back. It turned out we didn't have the stock, and the count reverted. Pretty cool, right? So that's what use optimistic does. It says, as soon as I click that like button, let's go ahead and set optimistic liked to true. This is where we can do that. And this is like a special kind of pointer to the current UI. Optimistic lets you jump out of the transition and say, I actually want to update the current UI while we're in a period of transition. While the transitions are pending, I want to use something from that future world that's being prepared and show it in the current UI. It's kind of like, you might see this in the React docs. Use optimistic is like looking into the future. We're looking into the future UI that we expect to come back, but we want to make those updates right now to our current UI while still keeping the rest of the current UI responsive, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's what this setter lets you do. It's very magical. And now you just render from this and you set it to +1 and it will read from this optimistic write while your action is pending. And as you saw, if I were to refresh this, let's add 1 to the stock. I'm going to click this. It goes right away to 50, and then it succeeds, and we're good to go. But now we don't have any stock left. So I'm going to click this 2 times. It goes up to 52. But when the actions come back, we see it actually reverts. So what happened there? Where's the code that says, we had an action come back, and it turns out it failed, so I need to undo this. You'd expect to see something like, set, if this is an error, if this works, then we're good. Otherwise, if this doesn't work, maybe we have to do something like this and set it back down to 1. And then again, this is an async function. So maybe you would do like await let result equals await if result is not okay. Now we have to go back. But again, hopefully after this conversation, your spidey sense is going off because you're calling set all around an await, and you can imagine this being very difficult to manage. So I'm going to go back to my actual code. And where is that code? Where's the code that's decrementing it by 1? Well, you're not going to find it anywhere. And this is the most beautiful, elegant thing about this whole model, is that because is pending is something that React now comprehends. It's a first-class concept in React. It's not just an is loading state or an is animating state. React knows there's a version of your app that is in a pending state. And it really means that while it's pending, the client is kind of like the source of truth because the client knows more than the server at this point. As soon as you click like, you need to wait the speed of light for that thing to get to your database. So in that interim time, your client knows more than the server. And this is so cool because as React knows it's pending, optimistic data is going to use whatever crazy stuff you've done here to update the UI and show off some feedback immediately. But as soon as isPending flips to false, all of this gets thrown away. And this data, this optimistic data right here, reverts to whatever the value of data is, which comes in from the server. So it's like your UI is switching between the client and the server and the client as a source of truth when your app is either in a settled state or in a pending state.
Awesome. So the use optimistic hook or the optimistic update ties really nicely with our transitions and actions. I've had folks asking me before that, well, what's the point of use optimistic? You could just handle this yourself. And you demonstrated the problems with handling it yourself with all the async and set state updates in there. So the beauty of the use optimistic is that it handles the update that the user intends to do immediately. So you see that feedback on the UI while this transition is happening. And also another point in it is that if something goes wrong, it discards the updates and goes back to the source of truth, being that data that you've passed into the use optimistic, which is coming from your server. Even after the update, accounts that as the source of truth.
Exactly. It's as if after this thing settles right here, if we were to refresh and I click add to cart, it doesn't work and we show 50. If I hit refresh right now, 50 is correct. We all know that once you hit refresh, that's like, okay, things are right because we're just rendering from use query. But after I've gone and made all these changes to my state, there's so many bugs that can happen where, oh, I forgot to revert that. Like I was saying, maybe I needed to subtract one because one of the 4 didn't work, right? You're doing a lot of bookkeeping. You're having to do all that bookkeeping yourself. Because of the way Use Optimistic works, you're actually guaranteed that your data is going to be as if you pressed Command R, as if you refresh the page. It's a guarantee that React can give you because it literally discards any calls here that you want. Contrast that to going back to our naive solution, right? And now let's say we wanted to add optimistic updates here. So actually, let me just copy this. Let me go to naive, copy this. Let's go to our page, paste this in. So now we're back to our first naive approach. And I can press 1. Let's see here. 2. Do we not have a pending? So it's pending. Oh, I think oh, that one has start transition. This is the naive. Let's get this one. So this is the version
we started off with.
Exactly. So I should have just been pasting these in. But if we start over here, reset our cart. Now I've got 2 in stock. So this is 1, and I press that. That looks all right. Let's add 2. Now let's press it twice. 1, 2, 2, 3. So that was the original race condition that we talked about. Mm-hmm. And but let's ignore that for now, and let's say you said you have people saying, well, I can just do this myself, right? This is easy to make optimistic. Right here, I'm going to say, I don't know, optimistic data. Just kind of just do it ourselves. And right here, instead of waiting for the fetch, let's just set optimistic data. We'll basically do the same thing, right? And we'll say, oh, data dot items. That's the count. So let's just say set optimistic data. This is the current data, and we're just going to copy the data. And then we'll say items is data to items plus 1, right? So oh, I think I need that, right? Yeah. Okay, so now, sorry, New York City, they're doing work outside. I've got 4 stock. I've got 3 in my cart, and I'm going to press it. Whoops, that didn't work. data.items. Set optimistic data. Here, let's just do this real quick because I think this will be very instructive. Let's just take a look at data. Data is an ID in items, right? So let's just do set optimistic data. We'll just do it kind of naive for now. This is like ID. And then items is going to be data.items plus 1, right? That should work. Refresh. Set optimistic data. And then we need to render from
we're not
optimistic.
reading it, yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. So now we're doing our own optimistic data, right? This is not, I see. This is, it's because we don't have data, we're not suspending here. So,
You can already see the problems with
exactly.
we don't
That's
have
exactly
the
right.
data yet.
I could say, let's see here. How about we just do something simpler?
You don't have to have a use effect to get the data.
No use effect. We already have an event. Right here, I'm going to set optimistic data to a copy of the data, as well as items is data.items plus 1. And now this might be null, right? This is going to be null or this object. And so maybe if we have optimistic data, we'll set optimistic data.items. Otherwise, we'll render kind of from the source of truth, right? So now we have 6, right? And I go up to here, and I click Add. Boom, optimistic UI, 7. Pretty cool. Here we go. Let's do it. 8, 9. Oh, well, that didn't work. Let's add 2 stocks. Let's press it twice. 1, 2. Oh, that jumped. What's happening here? Well, optimistic data needs to be actually dependent on optimistic data. So this is going to be current, and it relies on the previous version. So we need to use it like this. This is stale. So this is going to be, let's see, if we don't have optimistic data, then we'll do what we did. Otherwise, we need to set it from its previous version. So current, and we'll copy current, and then we'll get current.items plus 1, something like that. I think we need this. Yep. Okay, so now we've got 11. Let's add 2 to the stock. 12, 13. Oh, that looks pretty good. Okay. Let's add 2 to the stock. 14, 15, 16. Nice. Except we don't have 16 because we didn't account for this failing. And now if I refresh, we're going to see the correct value of 15.
15.
So first of all, look at this mess. Second of all, it doesn't even work. So anyone who says that it's optimistic data is easy, we can do it ourselves. Now look at how this behaves, our optimistic UI. I'm going to copy that, put this right here. And look how easy this is. Refresh. 1, 2, 3. Not to mention our loading state was all messed up. I added 1 too many right here. We have 18, but once we get the response, it shows the correct error message. The cart resets. If I refresh again, guaranteed to see the same thing here. And look how much less code. It's so fun because I've done some really cool UIs with like animated resortable list using optimistic and framer motion. And you're going to town, and all you're doing is calling set here and there every time framer motion gives you a callback. And then you let go, and you just send it all. Maybe you send multiple ones. And it comes back, and if anything fails, you don't have to clean anything up. There's no long-lived state for you to manage. It just reverts. It is honestly such a beautiful pattern and design that falls out from the design of transitions and the fact that React knows that your app is kind of in this pending state. And as soon as it's not, we're just going to revert to all the initial rendering logic, and you don't have to clean anything up. You know, so another way that people usually do optimistic, instead of what we just did where we do it manually, you might have something like a use mutation hook. And all of these data libraries have have solutions for this, but they're pretty hard to get right. And if you've ever worked with Apollo's cache or React Queries cache, you know it can be hard to manage that cache correctly and have it revert correctly because there's all sorts of things coming in and out, and it's just more state to maintain. So you might have a use mutation where you're gonna create API, create a blog post, and then you have something like an on like before, I don't know what it's called before. Let's actually just pull it up. React Query Cache. And again, nothing to knock on these libraries. It's really cool that mutation, React Query Mutation, TanStack Query Mutation Cache. But all of these libraries have had to do this themselves. Actually, let's just search for optimistic UI. Anyway, there's some cache here. There's a query key you have to invalidate. I've done more work with Apollo Cache, but you know what I'm talking about, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yep.
It's the same concept also in SWR.
Exactly.
Where you would mutate, and then you have this cache that it's just more work that you have to
exactly. It's
take
like
care
this.
of.
It's a lot more bookkeeping. So you have some update function, and when I call add to do, I'm going to go ahead and modify this, and I'm going to, basically update this. This is kind of similar to the settings side, except it's just a lot more pleasant that I can just get my own state here. There's no global state I have to manage. I can just do whatever my UI calls for right here. I don't have to worry about IDs and merging records with things that are in flight or not. I just get to go to town right here locally. I have some other demos where I have a bunch of different actions doing all sorts of different things. They all have their own little set optimistic. I love how co-located it is. And then at the end of the day, it all gets cleaned up. Whereas here, you usually need to say like on return, let's go ahead and update that cache again. On query updated, blah, blah, blah. So anyways, not only do I really love this design, and not only is it more powerful than any library could do on its own because of the fact that React now knows you're in a pending state, and so it can create something like useOptimistic that is robust to all these concurrency conditions, all the race conditions, and yet still throw everything away and just revert to the server-side source of truth once the app is settled. Not only all that, but it can be composed across different libraries. So again, going back to our earlier point, if SWR or Apollo was rendering from cache and it was optimistic, there's nothing that React knows to say it's optimistic. And if you had one part of the screen that was from SWR and then another part that was optimistic, that's in a different component, maybe in your header, maybe notifications count. Maybe when I click notifications, I want to take the counter down in the title bar as well as the main screen by 1. That's optimistic, while I like send a red mutation to the server that says I've read this, so I can reduce the inbox count by 1. All of those things can't know about each other in a way that React knows about, but now there's some really cool composition patterns with use optimistic, and again, the fact that you could even wait until an animation finishes, anything else that starts a transition, it all composes. So it's really setting us up for some amazing possibilities in the library and ecosystem space that should make all of this sort of stuff so much easier for us, just eliminate so much bookkeeping. And again, if you look at the final version here, what's really cool about what's inside of here is it is really just our business logic. This could be a call to Prisma if this was a server action. But it's basically business logic, revalidate, or return an error. This is our business logic. Compare that to the initial version where there's preventing default, bookkeeping, and a bunch of bugs. So
Exactly.
it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing.
Exactly. So to summarize, the React action is giving us it's an entrance to transitions and the concurrency API in React, where it allows you to handle your form submissions or mutations in a better way. So you avoid this race conditions by the concurrency API. It gives or leaves your UI interactive. It also ties really nicely with the optimistic UI in that you can immediately update the UI so the user has a instant feedback of what is going on, and then it discards it automatically when the action or the transition comes off the pending state. So it's really the concurrency API or the transitions behind the scene, and then this would be the fruits or the hooks that we can use from it. And I also like that where you said, just like how hooks allowed us to work with different libraries or interconnect these different libraries or different functionalities from different libraries. This useActionState or primitive in React, now that it understands this async or this transition is happening, it also, I think, opens up a lot of doors. Maybe in a world where some of these libraries even give you the action prop that you can pass into their component.
That's exactly right. So if you read the blog post about React 19, one of the things they talked about after introducing actions, and again, this is nothing to do with server actions, just this action prop, startTransition, async functions, is that they want libraries that offer UI components that typically would be used for actions, for server-side mutations, to start exposing action props. For example, let's say you have a switch toggle, from Radix, and just like if you were building a settings screen, and you do the switch and you auto-save it, right? So today that might look like capital switch, and actually let me share my screen again really quick. Let's say you had something like a switch, right? And maybe this is like wrapped in a label, and it's like airplane mode, right? And this is on or off. Today, if you wanted to autosave this, you would do something like on change, handle switch, handle airplane mode toggle. And we're kind of back to, let's get a function. Maybe this is async. We're going to await a fetch to API toggle. And then, well, we need some state is, airplane mode on, something like that. False. We need to give this a value, airplane mode. And right here we await, and then we can set airplane mode to whatever the response is, right? Response.val, whatever this is, right? So this onChange prop, this is the important part. This onChange prop is something that Radix provides from Switch. You're using it for an action. This is an action. It's just that React doesn't know it's an action. It's just an async function. But React has no knowledge of that, so you're back to all the same problems. Look, we're awaiting, and then we're calling setState. What happens if I press this twice while the fetch is going out? We're back to race conditions. Exactly. What happens if I set it and it failed? There's no notion of like the switching from server-side source of truth to client-side source of truth. So what the recommendation here is that instead, in addition to these events that we're used to, like onChange and onSelect, same thing for a select, onSelect, you're going to handle this, right? We're going to start providing change actions and select action. And the goal is for UI libraries to provide these action props. And there's nothing special about this name. It's just a convention that they're telling us that's like so that we all know, oh, hey, This is an action. What does that mean? It's going to be marked as a transition, which means anything I pass in here, I can't call set state and have it run immediately, right? This is going to give me is toggled. I'm going to move this right here. But what's cool about this is all the stuff that we saw before. How do I get the original state? Well, I have some use query, or I'm using airplane mode. I'm using a server component. I get my data. Value is data.airplane mode. Don't have this anymore. Now I change this. But what can I do? Well, I can use optimistic right here. I can set this right here, set optimistic toggle. But even better, Radix Switch could do that internally because it knows that there is an action.
Transition,
and it knows that there's a transition. And it knows when the function I passed in is asynchronous. So they'll be able to provide optimistic UI out the gate. You'll be able to say something like optimistic true or false. If it's true, they're going to switch it for you. And what's beautiful about this is that they can use optimistic internally, which means once your app settles and this thing revalidates, it will flip back to the current actual source of truth. No bookkeeping, nothing for you to do. And you could say optimistic false, and they could show a spinner next to it instead, or make it wait and put it in an indeterminate state, like on iOS when something takes a long time. So just look how much easier this is. There's no state to manage. All you do is you give it the canonical version, you give it the action. This action can do anything. It can hit an API, it can run an animation, and it's just so powerful, the composition patterns that this is going to open up.
Absolutely. So it's basically everything that we had done abstracted away inside that switch component that you get from this component UI library. And it just does all of that for you. You can just set some props to say what you want and what you don't. And it just takes care of all that stuff that we explained and the benefits under the hood, which is exciting to see coming
Super exciting.
into. Exactly. So we talked about the React action inside of the client side, inside of a pure React client side. Just to tie it back real quickly to Next.js, it's the same component that we were working on. If it was on the server, in a server component, instead of just using that use query to fetch the data, we would just fetch our database directly inside of a server component, and that would be our initial reference for our use optimistic, and then we would have our form as a client component to be able to use that use action state to then use the benefits of the pending state, the error state that comes back. So it's everything would be almost the same. The only difference with that would be that the function that you're passing in to your use action state is now going to be a server action. You can just mark it as a server action by adding that use server directive, and that's it. So it's both works on the client side or the way that we are used to from the Next.js kind of lens in server actions.
That's exactly right. Here's the final version that uses RSC. We replaced the use query with an await. So this is all running on the server. This is a server component. And we have an action right here that's defined using use server. So this is a server action. And I have a little client component right here, a form that I give the action to. You could also import a server action right here if it was like a user form, something specific, but this is just kind of generic. And you'll see all this stuff right here. Use action state, passes forward that prop, gets the error, form action is pending. And I'm just using a little context right here so I can do some cool stuff like show my form error or my pending. But what's really neat is that this is equivalent of what we were seeing before, right? So at the end of the day, we're rendering a form and we're passing in an action. But now you know an action is just an async function. Well, an action is really a transition with an async function. The action prop takes in an async function and it marks it as a transition. But regardless, this action prop does not know or care what kind of async function this is. So the fact that we're passing through an action that happens to be a server action doesn't matter. It's an async function. And so form doesn't know whether you're even passing in a client action or a server action. In a sense, there's no real difference. It's just an async function that gets marked as a transition.
Exactly.
which is pretty fascinating.
Yes, exactly. So from that perspective, it's just an async function, an async transition. Now, in the context of Next.js, you just marked it as a server action, which is basically, again, an async function that you define on the server and you can pass it to the client side.
Yes, exactly.
So it just ties in really nicely, bringing it all back to the server as well. Okay,
exactly.
Awesome. So I think this was a very comprehensive, useful introduction to React Actions and how it just works under the hood and ties back into what we already know from server actions in Next.js, but we never understood how this works or how is it outside of Next.js in terms of React primitives. So thank you very much for the thorough explanation here.
No problem. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, awesome. So if you loved this as I did, definitely follow Sam's work. We're going to include links in the description for his channel. I know you have an upcoming course coming on BuildUI. Do you want to talk about that shortly so folks know what exactly you're working on?
Sure. We are working on an advanced React component patterns course. We'll have 6 or 7 demos talking about some of the most kind of powerful patterns you can use to make components that are really reusable, really powerful. Things like compound components and render props and unstyled components. We'll be talking about useActionStore, useActionStore, which is a hook that lets components or hooks interact with data that lives outside of React. We have a recursive component demo in there. So all these kind of fun advanced patterns that you probably see if you use libraries like Radix or ShadCN or Aria or Framer Motion, but you don't always know how to do it yourself in your own work. And if you ever are working on your own apps and you run into that spot where you're like, oh, I know I have this code somewhere else. How do I share it? But I don't want to go down a bad path and make a bad abstraction. Now I have to shove all the styling in here. You know, I have a newsletter sign up and I want one on the sidebar. Does that mean I have to make a newsletter component and have like sidebar is true? I just want to share the functionality. It's that kind of thing. It's like knowing what pattern to reach for when you hit that moment and you're like, I want to share this, but I don't know how. So we'll put a link up to that. It's going to be coming out in October. We have like a little teaser site up on buildui.com right now where you can sign up for emails and just the newsletter basically and keep up to date with that. And if you want to get a taste for some of that content, you can check out the last few videos on my YouTube channel. I'm going to be working on another one this week that talks about some of those patterns.
I'm so excited for that course to come up, and I'm glad you mentioned the last video because your content is almost giving me at least this concept of thinking as a library author in a way to say, okay, how do I compose my own components? How do I abstract customizability into my components, but do it in the right way so I can really share this between different projects or I don't know, maybe even in a monorepo setting. Mm-hmm. So it's amazing in that sense. I'm looking forward for that course to come up. We're going to include links in the description to Sam's channel, BuildUI, and hopefully that course that comes up. Once again, Sam, you've been inspiring in my own journey and continue doing the great work that you're doing. And thank you very much for joining me on this session.
Thanks so much for having me, man. It was great to meet you. Glad we got to catch up again and look forward to seeing more of your work soon.
Awesome. Okay, guys, that's a wrap. So if you have any questions, hit me up in the comments and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.